Here's the brief news from the world over this week. On Thursday, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that 4 Christian nonprofits should not have to comply with the Obamacare mandate that all employer health care plans must cover contraception and sterilization services. While employers can seek an exemption to the law, the court argued that doing so poses a substantial burden to that organization's religious freedom. The decision is particularly important because it directly contradicts another federal court's ruling, creating a circuit split. The Supreme Court is already considering several cases involving the birth control mandate, which it will consider taking up this fall. Security is a top concern for officials as Pope Francis's arrival in the U.S. nears. The FBI announced this week that a terror plot was foiled in August. The case involved a 15-year-old boy near Philadelphia. The teenager, purportedly inspired by ISIS, sought to organize an assault on the Pope involving explosives, multiple attackers, and weapons. He distributed his plans via social media. Sources say the teen's plans were aspirational and posed no imminent danger. Meanwhile, federal and New York City officials say that there are so far no credible terrorist threats detected against Pope Francis. At a press conference in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio said he wants the visit to be a safe time in the city.
Extraordinary efforts have been engineered to ensure the safety, first of all, of His Holiness and of all the world leaders, but of course of all New Yorkers and all our visitors as well.
Vatican spokesman Father Federico Lombardi said this week that a visit with Fidel Castro is likely when the Pope is in Havana on Sunday. The meeting depends on the health of the communist revolutionary and longtime Cuban strongman. According to reports, Pope Francis requested the meeting. Meanwhile, ahead of the papal visit, President Raul Castro ordered the release of more than 3,500 prisoners. It is the third time Cuba has granted inmates freedom before a papal visit. The government is not releasing people convicted of crimes violating state security. That designation is usually applied to political prisoners or dissidents. We will bring you the entire papal visit to Cuba starting Saturday with the Pope's arrival in the island nation. And sure to be a hot topic during the Pope's U.S. visit, climate change. The Holy Father this week received the environmental ministers from the European Union. In a possible preview of the comments he could make here in D.C. and at the United Nations next week, he urged the ministers to intensify their work and to get the desired result by adopting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at the end of this month. He also urged support for the Climate Change Summit in Paris this December. He described the environment as a collective good, the patrimony of all humanity, and the responsibility of each of us. The Pope repeated the idea of ecological debt and the commerce-related imbalances between North and South. First surfacing in his encyclical on the environment, the Pope decried the disproportionate use of natural resources by some states. And although the Pope is pushing for the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the bishops of Africa and Madagascar are warning against them. They called such attempts by the West to influence Africa a terrifying resurgence of a colonialist spirit. In a common declaration released this week, the African bishops specifically called out the United Nations and Western governments' push for access to abortion on their continent. They said, it can no longer be denied that under the euphemism of sexual and reproductive health and rights, such programs are plainly imposing conditions for development assistance. The African bishops called these campaigns filthy, and they say they promote a civilization of death on our continent. Continuing, the bishops said they're unwilling to have Africans seen only as servile partners of the West or, quote, a new type of slavery. We want the dignity of our people to be respected, end quote. Meanwhile, Pope Francis has sent out the final invites to the upcoming Synod on the Family. Announced this week, the Holy Father made 45 personal appointments. among the 279 bishops who will participate in the synod this October. Among the names on his list are a few prelates who have been vocal in their desire to reform the Church's pastoral approach. They include Cardinal Walter Casper, who led the initiative last year to allow divorced and remarried Catholics to receive Holy Communion without an annulment; Belgian Cardinal Godfried de Niels, who said in 2013 that the advent of gay civil unions is a positive development. De Niel also pointed out that the Church has never objected to the fact that there is a sort of marriage between homosexuals. Vienna Cardinal Christoph Schonborn will also be at the synod. The Cardinal recently suggested that a stable gay relationship is better than a temporary one. The Pope did appoint South African Cardinal Wilfred Fox Napier, who was an outspoken defender of church teaching on marriage at last year's synod. Not invited by the Pope is Cardinal Raymond Burke. He led the charge against Cardinal Casper's proposal at the last synod. More on these and other key appointments and what they might mean to the synod in our next segment. And the political crisis in Northern Ireland is headed into a third week. First Minister Peter Robinson recently stepped down along with all but one of his party's ministers. This effectively shut down the power-sharing government. At issue is the alleged murder by the Irish Republican Army operatives of a former member last month. Robinson, who heads the pro-British Democratic Unionist Party, sought an investigation into the murder, only to be rejected by the other parties of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Talks to save the government are scheduled to take place in the coming days. Ulster Unionist Party leader Mike Nesbitt said on Monday that Sinn Féin has to accept that the IRA had some involvement in the murder. Otherwise, the talks are doomed. Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness is warning that talks cannot have preconditions and that a fresh Assembly election are the next logical step should talks fail. And the United Kingdom may be on the verge of adopting some rather controversial counter-terrorism measures. According to a leaked draft document obtained by the Sunday Telegraph, the British government is considering a national registry of faith leaders. This would require priests, rabbis, imams, and other religious figures to register and be subject to government vetting, including, quote, specified training and security checks. The report comes just after the UK announced it killed 2 British citizens who had become ISIS fighters in a drone strike. The individuals were in Syria and are believed to have been radicalized at a controversial mosque in Wales. And doctor-assisted suicide could soon be the law of the land in California. This past week, the state legislature gave final approval to a bill that would allow terminally ill patients to legally end their lives. Governor Jerry Brown has so far not offered a position on the measure, but he was critical of the legislature for fast-tracking the bill with little deliberation or debate. The measure requires that 2 doctors approve the suicide and that the patient be physically capable of taking the life-ending drugs on their own. Following the passage of the bill, L.A. Archbishop Jose Gomez said, "This is not legalizing aid in dying. This is legalizing the ability of a doctor to write prescriptions for the express purpose of killing another human being." Physician-assisted suicide is legal in Vermont, Montana, Washington, and Oregon. Meanwhile, back in Great Britain last week, the House of Commons overwhelmingly rejected an assisted suicide measure there based on the Oregon law by a 3-to-1 margin. And finally, the Vatican is studying the suspected miracle that could lead to the canonization of Blessed Mother Teresa. An official with the Vatican's Congregation for Saints told Catholic News Agency that the case involves a Brazilian man. He was inexplicably cured of 8 debilitating brain abscesses in 2008. The priest who was ministering to the suffering man at the time told him to pray without ceasing to Mother Teresa for comfort and strength. The possible miracle is still being examined by doctors from the dicastery. The case would also need to be considered by a theological council before receiving final approval by the Pope. The Holy Father has voiced his desire to canonize Mother Teresa during the Year of Mercy, which begins on December 8th. We'll keep you posted. Before we continue, a little promotion, if you'll permit me. I want to encourage all of you to join EWTN News for an historical moment that will never come again. We will bring you live, complete coverage of Pope Francis's trip to Cuba and to the United States starting this Saturday afternoon. So many are going to be covering this visit from the outside, not here. As we have for nearly 2 decades, we will bring you the event from the inside, with perspectives and context, lived experience that you just won't find anywhere else. Father Jerry Murray and Robert Royal will join me, and we will feature some of the most informed experts in the nation. For me, this is not one visit, but a piece of something much larger. The trips to Cuba and the U.S. are building toward the larger story, the Synod on the Family in October. Join us as we unpack Pope Francis' historic moments in America and help you understand what it really means. It begins this weekend. You can find the latest schedules at EWTN.com. And be sure to follow me at Raymond Arroyo on Twitter for updates and backgrounds on the entire visit. It's going to be quite a trip. Don't miss a moment of it.